That's not a dress. Eleanor Voss pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, and the laugh slipped out anyway, bright and sharp in the warm, dusty air of the general store. That's a potato sack with sleeves. Laughter rolled through the aisles. A jar of peppermint sticks rattled on its shelf. Behind the counter, Mr. Baker suddenly found something urgent to do with a ledger he had already balanced twice that morning. 6-year-old Maisie Whittaker looked down at the faded brown cloth hanging crooked from her thin shoulders, patched twice at the hem, mended once at the collar, and said nothing at all. She had learned, in her short life, that saying nothing usually made things end faster. Her mother, Nora, wrapped her fingers around the girl's small hand and pulled her half a step closer. "Come on, sweetheart. We have what we came for." Maisie nodded and kept her chin steady, though her eyes had already gone glassy in a way she was fighting hard to hide. She counted the floorboards instead of looking at anyone. 6 boards to the door. Then 7. Near the window, a chair scraped back across the wooden floor, slow and deliberate. Every head in the store turned. Cole Mercer, the richest rancher in 3 counties, rose to his full height and did not look at Eleanor Voss. He did not look at the women still giggling behind their gloves, or at Mr. Baker's suddenly very interesting ledger. His attention had fixed itself, without permission from the rest of him, on a small silver locket swinging gently against Maisie's collarbone as she turned toward the door. The color drained out of his face. He knew that locket. He had held it once, years ago, in a much younger hand than the one that hung heavy at his side now. Nobody in the store noticed except Nora, who felt the shift in the air the way a person feels weather changing before the clouds arrive. She tightened her grip on Maisie's hand and steered her toward the door a little faster. Cole didn't stop them. He didn't say a word. But by the time the bell over the door had stopped ringing behind them, he had already decided one thing with the same certainty he brought to every decision that mattered. He was not going to let that locket, or the little girl wearing it, walk out of his life without an answer. Because somewhere behind that quiet, careful stare, Cole Mercer understood that the poorest child in Red Hollow was about to turn his whole guarded, orderly life upside down, and that once the truth of who she was came out, nothing in this town would look the same again.
Red Hollow sat where the plains gave up trying to be gentle and turned hard, rocky, and honest about what it was. Winter arrived early there and stayed long past its welcome, and in the years since the railroad had chosen a route 30 miles east instead, most families in town had learned to make do with less of everything: less rain most seasons, less credit at the bank, less patience for softness of any kind. Nora Whittaker had learned that lesson better than most. 2 winters back she had buried her husband, Daniel, in the small cemetery behind the church, beneath a wooden marker she had carved herself because she could not afford a stone one. Since then she had taken in washing and mending for anyone in town willing to pay a widow a fair price for honest work. Most weeks, that was almost enough to keep the roof sound and the pantry from going empty. Some weeks, it wasn't. Maisie's dress had belonged to a neighbor's daughter 3 winters before that, handed down the way most things in Red Hollow were handed down, from a family with slightly more to a family with slightly less. Nora had let the hem down twice as Maisie grew, and taken it back up once when the girl had a fever that kept her thin for a season, and there was no amount of careful stitching left in the world that could hide the plain truth that the child had simply outgrown the cloth faster than her mother could replace it. Maisie did not complain about it. She had her father's steadiness in her, an odd, calm patience that made her seem older than 6 most days and exactly 6 on others, when the wind was warm enough for chasing barn cats and the world felt briefly fair. So when Eleanor Voss and her friends laughed that morning over the counter of W.S. Baker and Sons, Maisie only looked at her boots and waited for it to be over, the way she had learned to wait out a bad storm on the porch, still, quiet, and certain it would eventually pass. Cole Mercer had been sitting near the window with a list of ranch supplies half read in his lap, a stranger to nearly everyone in town and a friend to almost no one either. People said he had more cattle than sense for company these days, that he had buried whatever warmth he once had alongside his younger brother years back and had never gone looking for it again. He kept to his ranch, kept to his business, and kept his hat low enough that most folks couldn't say for certain what he was thinking, ever. He watched the whole scene that morning without moving a muscle. He watched Maisie's chin drop and then lift itself back up, slow and deliberate, like she'd practiced the motion before. He watched Nora's knuckles whiten around her daughter's hand. He watched the way the wealthy women in their fine coats never once looked at the child as a person, only as a joke they had already decided the punchline to. And then he watched the locket, catching a stray beam of morning light as Maisie turned. It was small, tarnished faintly at the edges, oval in shape, with a thin rose etched across its face. He had seen a locket exactly like it once before, in an old photograph nailed inside a drawer at his ranch house that he had not opened in longer than he cared to admit. He said nothing while mother and daughter were still inside the store. He only followed them with his eyes until the door swung shut, and a few minutes later, once he'd settled his account without really hearing what Mr. Baker told him it came to, he followed them with his boots. Eleanor Voss noticed him leave in such a hurry and turned to her friend with a knowing little laugh. Well, it seems even Cole Mercer has his soft moments. Probably going to toss the widow a coin out of pity. She smoothed her gloves and went back to admiring the new bolt of calico on the counter, already certain she understood exactly what she had seen. She understood nothing at all. Out on the street, Cole stood a moment beneath the store's wooden awning, hat low against the sun, turning the shape of the locket over and over in his mind the way a man turns a coin he suspects might be counterfeit. He told himself it was only a resemblance. Lockets like that had likely been made by the dozen, back east, sold in shops from Boston to St. Louis. He told himself that twice, and believed it neither time. Cole caught up with them at the edge of the boardwalk, where the wind had picked up and Nora was already pulling her shawl tighter around Maisie's shoulders against it. Mrs. Whitaker. Nora turned, wary the way most folks in Red Hollow were wary of him, not from anything he had ever actually done to earn it, but from everything a man with his kind of money could do if he chose to. Wealth made people careful. Careful people made assumptions. Mr. Mercer. That locket your daughter's wearing. He kept his voice even, gentler than his reputation suggested he was capable of. Where did it come from? Something shifted behind Nora's eyes, quick and guarded, there and gone in the space of a breath. It belonged to my husband. It was his mother's before that. May I ask her name? You may not. Nora's voice had gone flat and final, the tone of a woman closing a door before it could be pushed open any further. Good day, Mr. Mercer. She walked Maisie down the boardwalk without looking back, boots quick against the planks, and Cole let her go. He had learned, in business and in life, that pushing on a locked door only ever made a person hold it tighter. But he had seen the fear in her face before she'd managed to smooth it over. Not embarrassment at being questioned by a wealthy man in the street. Fear. That night at the ranch, Cole sat at his father's old desk with a lamp burning low and finally pulled open a drawer he had avoided since his mother's funeral, 3 years gone now. Inside were letters tied with faded string, a pressed flower gone the color of weak tea, and a small tintype photograph he hadn't looked at in longer than he wanted to count. In it, a young woman stood beside a boy Cole recognized instantly as his older brother, Samuel, dead now more than 15 years by everything the family had ever believed. Around the woman's neck hung a locket, oval in shape, with a thin rose etched across its face. Cole sat with the photograph a long time, the lamp burning lower, the ranch quiet around him in the particular way a house gets quiet when its owner is the only person awake in it. His brother had left the ranch at 19, after a falling out with their father that no one in the family had ever spoken of afterward, not even at the funeral no one had been able to hold because there was never a body to bury. Samuel had simply gone, and never written, and never come home. The family had assumed, in the quiet way families assume things they cannot bear to ask about directly, that he had died somewhere out on the frontier, alone and unclaimed, his name fading a little more from memory with every passing year. Cole looked again at the tintype, then out through the dark window toward the direction of town, where a 6-year-old girl was sleeping in a 2-room house that night with a locket around her neck that, by every account he had ever been given, should not have existed anymore. He did not sleep much himself. Somewhere past midnight, he carried the lamp to the parlor and stood in front of the framed portrait of his mother that hung above the cold hearth. Ruth Mercer had died believing her eldest son was lost to her forever, buried somewhere she would never get to visit, mourned without so much as a marker to stand beside. She had kept his letters anyway, all the ones that had come before the silence, tied neatly with string in that same drawer, as though some part of her had never fully accepted the ending everyone else had settled on. If this is true, Cole said quietly to the empty room, I owe her a granddaughter she never got to meet. The house gave him no answer, but for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. Cole rode into town 3 days later and found Nora hanging wash behind her small house, clothespins gripped between her lips, the wind fighting her for every sheet on the line. She saw him coming before he'd even dismounted and set her jaw the way a person braces for bad news. If this is about the store account, I'll have it paid by month's end. It isn't. Then what is it? Work, Cole said, swinging down off his horse. I need someone who can sew and keep house 2 days a week out at the ranch. I'll pay fair wages, same as I'd pay any hand. Nora studied him for a long moment, the way a person studies an offer for the trap hidden somewhere inside it. I don't need charity, Mr. Mercer. I'm not offering any. His tone stayed level, almost businesslike. I'm offering a job. You're welcome to turn it down if the wages aren't fair. But you don't get to turn it down just because you've decided I'm being kind. I'm not a particularly kind man, Mrs. Whitaker. You can ask anyone in town. That, for reasons she couldn't quite name, pulled the corner of Nora's mouth up despite herself. 2 days a week. And I set my own hours. Fine. Maisie came around the corner of the house just then, hair loose from its braid, cheeks pink from the cold, and looked Cole over with the frank, unbothered curiosity that only children manage around powerful men. Mama says you're the richest man in 3 counties. She shouldn't tell you that. Maisie looked down at his boots, caked in a week's worth of dust and manure. Then why are they so dirty? Behind Cole, his foreman Eli Turner, who had ridden along and said nothing until that exact moment, nearly choked on the coffee he'd carried over in a battered tin cup. Cole looked down at his own boots, then back up at the girl, and something loosened in his face that hadn't loosened in longer than he could remember. He laughed. Short, surprised, almost rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in years finally giving way. Nora watched it happen and filed the moment away carefully, without quite meaning to. You're funny, Maisie decided, satisfied, and wandered off toward the barn cat sunning itself on the woodpile as though the matter were fully settled. That evening, riding back toward the ranch with the sky going orange behind the hills, Eli glanced sideways at his boss. Never once seen you laugh at nothing before. Wasn't nothing. Didn't say it was. Just an observation. Eli let the silence stretch a moment, the horse's hooves the only sound on the trail. You gonna tell me why you're suddenly so interested in a widow's mending, or am I supposed to guess? Cole didn't answer, and Eli, who had ridden for him going on 9 years, knew better than to ask twice in the same night. But he noted it, the way a good foreman notes changes in weather, and decided to keep watching the sky. Nora arrived at the ranch 2 days later for her first afternoon of work, apron tied tight, a basket of mending balanced on one hip and Maisie trailing behind her clutching a rag doll with one button eye. The ranch house was larger than anything Nora had set foot in since she was a girl herself, all polished floors and quiet rooms that echoed a little too much for a place that was supposed to be a home. You live here alone? Maisie asked, wandering the front hall with open curiosity while her mother set to work in the sewing room. Mostly. Eli stays in the bunkhouse with the other hands. That seems lonely. Cole, who had not intended to spend his afternoon standing in his own front hall answering questions from a 6-year-old, found he didn't much mind it. I suppose it is, some days. You should get a dog, Maisie decided, with the flat authority of someone who had solved a great many problems already that morning. Dogs make houses less lonely. Everybody knows that. He very nearly laughed again. Twice in 1 week, after years of going without. Graham Voss arrived at Nora's door 2 weeks later in a suit too fine for a weekday, his smile polished the particular way a banker's smile is always polished, warm on the surface and calculated underneath. "Mrs. Whittaker. I won't take much of your time. Then say what you came to say, Mr. Voss. Your late husband's note with the bank is coming due sooner than I'd like to remind a grieving widow of." He folded his hands, gentle as a preacher. "I could extend the terms, generously, if you'd consider selling the property instead. I have a buyer who'd treat you fair. More than fair, I'd wager. This land is my daughter's inheritance. It isn't for sale, and it wasn't for sale the last time you asked, either." Graham's smile didn't move, though something behind his eyes did. "Everything's for sale eventually, Mrs. Whittaker. I'd rather you sell it to me on friendly terms than lose it on unfriendly ones." He tipped his hat and left without waiting for a reply, and Nora stood in her doorway a long while after his buggy had rolled off down the lane, arms wrapped tight around herself against a cold that had very little to do with the weather. Cole heard about the visit from Eli, who had heard it from the bank clerk, who owed Eli a favor from a poker game neither man discussed in daylight. He also learned, from land records Eli quietly pieced together over the following days, that Graham Voss had spent the better part of 2 years buying up nearly every parcel bordering Nora's small farm, one quiet purchase at a time. "Man's building something," Eli said, spreading the deeds flat across Cole's desk. "And your widow's plot sits right square in the middle of it." "She's not my widow." "Didn't say she was yours. Said she was a widow." Eli's eyes carried the particular teasing only an old friend can get away with. "Though you have ridden into town more this past month than the whole rest of the year combined." Cole ignored that and studied the deeds instead, jaw tight. Whatever Graham wanted the land for, he wanted it badly enough to pressure a grieving widow instead of simply making a fair offer to a neighbor, which told Cole plainly that the value wasn't only in the soil. It was buried somewhere in the paperwork, or in the ground itself, or in a name nobody in town was saying out loud yet. He rode to see Mrs. Beatrice Holloway that same afternoon. She had kept the dry goods counter at the Mercantile for 30 years and remembered every family in Red Hollow better than the county recorder ever would. "Whittaker," she repeated slowly, turning the name over like a coin worn smooth from handling. "Daniel Whittaker did business with your family once, years back, before your brother left home for good. I remember it clearly because it was the very last deal your father closed before that falling out." Cole went very still. "What kind of deal, Mrs. Holloway?" Beatrice's face closed like a shop shutting its doors at sundown. "That's a longer conversation than I'm ready to have today, Mr. Mercer. Come back when you're truly ready to hear the whole of it." Cole came back to Nora's house a final time before the harvest season made the roads difficult, and this time he didn't dance around the question that had been sitting in his chest for weeks. "Your husband knew my family," he said, once Maisie had wandered off toward the henhouse. "Before he passed." Nora's hands went still over the mending in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Cole let the silence stretch, the way he had learned to let a nervous horse settle before pushing it through a gate. "Daniel told me, before he died, never to trust Graham Voss with anything," she said finally, quietly. "He told me to keep the locket safe, no matter what happened. And he told me never to tell anyone in this town where Maisie truly came from." "Where she came from," Cole repeated slowly. "Not who her father is." Nora's eyes filled, and she blinked hard against it, though a few tears slipped free anyway. "Daniel raised her as his own from the time she was only weeks old. He loved her the way any father loves his daughter, fully and without reservation. But she wasn't born to us, Mr. Mercer. A woman passed through Red Hollow the winter before Maisie arrived, sick and entirely alone, with nowhere left to turn. She died 2 days after giving birth, and Daniel and I took the baby in and never once told a soul otherwise." "Did the woman give a name?" "She never gave one. Only the locket, and a plea that we keep the child away from anyone asking after a family called Mercer." Cole sat with that for a long moment, the pieces of a 15-year-old silence finally beginning to fit together in his mind, one after another, like a lock finding its key. "I believe that woman was married to my brother," he said quietly. "I believe Maisie is his daughter." Nora's face went pale. "If that becomes known in this town, if Graham Voss learns of it before we're ready. I'm not here to take your daughter away from you." Cole leaned forward, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice lost every trace of its careful, guarded distance. "I'm here to make certain nobody ever takes her from you. Not Graham Voss. Not anyone alive." Nora looked at him a long while, searching his face for the catch she was certain had to be hiding somewhere in an offer that generous. She didn't find one, no matter how carefully she looked. "All right," she said at last. "I believe you." It was the first time in 5 years she had said those words to a wealthy man in this town, and saying them felt, strangely, like setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she'd nearly forgotten it was there. They came after dark, for men on horseback with torches lit, doing their level best to look like trouble that had simply wandered in on its own instead of trouble that had been paid for. Cole was 2 hours' ride away, settling a dispute over stray cattle on the northern range, when word reached him by a breathless ranch hand on a lathered horse. By the time he and Eli made it back to Nora's place, the fence posts nearest the road were already burning against the black sky. Nora had sent Maisie to hide beneath the floorboards of the smokehouse the moment she heard hoofbeats on the lane, and she stood alone on her porch with her late husband's shotgun leveled steady at the lead rider, her hands not shaking at all. "Get off my land." "Just a friendly reminder, ma'am," the rider called down, "that Red Hollow's got no room for folks who don't know when it's time to sell." "I know exactly when it's time to sell. It isn't now, and it won't ever be to your employer." The rider laughed, low and ugly, and that was the sound Cole heard as he came riding in hard with Eli close behind him, both men armed and neither one inclined toward patience that night. The fight that followed was short, loud, and over almost before it began, ending with one rider thrown clean from his saddle, cursing into the dirt, as Eli's rope drew tight around his shoulders and pinned his arms. "Who sent you?" Cole demanded, standing over him with a boot planted near the man's chest. The rider spat blood into the dust and, in his anger, said the one word that changed everything. "Voss." Sheriff Caleb Dawson arrived at first light to find scorched fence posts, one captured rider locked overnight in his own smokehouse, and a widow who hadn't slept a single hour but hadn't backed down an inch either. "This isn't a simple property dispute anymore," Caleb said grimly, surveying the damage with his hat pushed back. "This is attempted intimidation, maybe worse than that. I'll need every scrap of evidence you've got, Mercer, and I'll need it soon." "You'll have it," Cole said. "All of it." Mrs. Beatrice Holloway finally told him the rest of it 2 days later, sitting across her own kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold and untouched between them. "Your brother Samuel married a young woman out east, against your father's wishes. That's the whole of what the falling out was truly about, whatever your father let the rest of town believe. Your father cut him off entirely, and Samuel chose to leave rather than give her up." She turned her cup slowly on its saucer, not drinking. "I always did wonder what became of her after he passed. Now, I suppose, we finally know. Samuel is dead." "You're certain of that?" "Died of fever, from what word reached me, a year or so before his wife came through Red Hollow carrying his child. She was trying to reach his family when her own health finally gave out on her." Beatrice's eyes were kind and sorrowful at once. "That little girl is your brother's daughter, Mr. Mercer. Which makes her the only Mercer blood left in this world besides yourself." Cole sat with that in a silence that stretched long enough to make the kitchen clock sound loud, the ranch house in his mind suddenly feeling both larger and emptier than it had that same morning. "Graham Voss knows all of this," Beatrice added, quieter now. "He was the one who handled some of the paperwork when that young woman first arrived in town, sick and asking after the Mercer ranch. He's known for years exactly whose daughter Maisie truly is, and exactly what that means for the inheritance he's been quietly working to claim through all that land he's bought up around her mother's farm. Cole rode straight for the courthouse records after that, and with Sheriff Dawson's help, spent 2 full days pulling together enough evidence. Old land filings, a witness statement Beatrice was finally willing to give under oath, a letter in his own mother's handwriting confirming Samuel's marriage back east, to make the truth impossible for anyone to bury a second time. Graham Voss, hearing through the bank grapevine that Cole was closing in fast, made one final and desperate move. He sent 2 men to Beatrice's shop that same night to destroy whatever records still remained on her shelves. They found Sheriff Dawson waiting there instead, sitting quiet in the dark with a lamp turned low and a shotgun across his knees. With his hired men caught and his scheme unraveling faster than he could patch it, Graham tried one final approach, summoning Nora to a meeting at the bank under the polite pretense of settling her account once and for all. "I'll forgive the entire debt," he told her, leaning across his own desk, "if you and the girl leave the county quietly. Tonight, if you're able." "You've known who she is," Nora said, standing rather than sitting across from him. "All along, you've known." Graham's composure finally cracked at the corners. "That girl's very existence threatens everything I've spent years building. Do you have any notion what happens to a man's reputation, his standing, his entire bank, if it comes out he spent years quietly trying to seize land that rightfully belongs to a Mercer heir? That isn't my problem to solve for you, Mr. Voss. It will be, Mrs. Whittaker, if you refuse my offer." Nora left the meeting shaking but resolved, and told Cole everything within the hour, sparing no detail. Cole, Sheriff Dawson, and Eli spent the rest of that day arranging a confrontation of their own, one that would happen in broad daylight, in full public view, where Graham Voss could not simply smile and deny his way clear of it. Eleanor Voss learned the truth about her husband's dealings that same afternoon, when Sheriff Dawson called at the house with a list of questions she had no ready answers for. She sat very still in her parlor as the pieces settled into place one by one, the quiet land purchases, the pressure on a grieving widow, the secret about a little girl's true identity that her own husband had kept even from her. The woman who had laughed loudest in the mercantile that morning found, for the first time in a long while, that she had absolutely nothing left to say. The confrontation happened on a Saturday morning, with half of Red Hollow gathered outside the bank for reasons that had nothing at all to do with banking and everything to do with the rumors that had already traveled through town twice over by breakfast. Graham stood on the steps, still trying to smile his way through it. "I don't know what wild story has been circulating, but I assure you all. It isn't a wild story," Cole said, stepping forward with a folder of papers held steady in one hand. "It's documented, every piece of it. Samuel Mercer married a woman named Elizabeth back east. She carried his child to Red Hollow after his death, hoping to find his family and give the baby a home among them. She died before she ever could. Daniel and Nora Whittaker raised that child as their own and kept her safe, exactly as her dying mother asked of them. That child is Maisie Whittaker, and she is the last living heir to the Mercer name." Murmurs rolled through the gathered crowd like wind through wheat. Mrs. Beatrice Holloway stepped forward to confirm what she knew before God and everyone, and Sheriff Dawson laid out, plainly and without embellishment, the evidence of Graham's land scheme and the hired men who tried to burn a widow off her own property. Graham's denials grew thinner with every sentence he tried to force out, until at last they stopped altogether, and he simply stood there on the bank steps with nothing left to say for himself. Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd, and for once in her life said nothing cruel at all. She only watched, ashamed down to her bones, as the very girl she had mocked over a worn, patched dress was revealed to be the child whose entire birthright her own husband had spent years quietly trying to steal. Maisie didn't understand every word of what was said that morning, but she understood enough of it. She reached for her mother's hand and held it tight, the exact same way she had that day in the mercantile weeks before, when the laughter had first started. Cole crouched down in front of her, right there on the bank steps with half the town looking on. "Nobody gets to decide what you're worth by what you wear," he told her, plain and steady. "Not that day. Not any day after it, either. Maisie nodded, solemn as a judge hearing a verdict, and then ruined the entire dignified moment by asking, "Does this mean I'm rich now?" The laughter that followed, this time, was warm all the way through. The weeks that followed unwound the last of Graham Voss's scheme, thread by thread. He lost his standing at the bank, his influence across the county, and eventually his marriage as well, as Eleanor packed her belongings and left Red Hollow without him, unwilling to spend one more year carrying the weight of what he had done. Nora kept her farm, free and clear of debt at last, the property secured legally in Maisie's name alongside whatever portion of the Mercer estate would one day pass down to her. Cole made certain of every last detail, and made just as certain that none of it ever felt like charity dressed up in kinder words. "I didn't do any of this so you'd owe me something," he told her one evening on her porch, the very same porch where night riders had once tried to burn her out of house and home. "I did it because it was right, plain and simple." "I know that," Nora said, looking out at the darkening fields. "That's rather the trouble, if I'm honest." "What trouble is that?" "It's difficult to keep being careful around a man who keeps proving, again and again, that he isn't dangerous at all." Cole smiled, slow and entirely real, and reached for her hand the way he'd wanted to for weeks now and hadn't quite let himself do until that moment. Their courtship grew the way most honest things grow, slowly and without much announcement to the rest of town. He taught Maisie to ride a gentle mare he had picked out himself, walking beside the animal for a full week before he'd let the girls so much as trot. Nora found, folded carefully inside his desk drawer one quiet afternoon while dusting, a crayon drawing Maisie had made of the three of them standing together outside the ranch house. He never once mentioned that he'd kept it. She never once mentioned that she'd found it. Both of them understood exactly what it meant without a single word passing between them on the matter. By the time spring came around again, Cole had asked Nora to bring Maisie and make the ranch their true home, not as any kind of rescue, but as a choice he sincerely hoped she would make freely, on her own terms. She said yes. Not because she needed saving from anything, but because for the first time in years, she simply wanted to stop being alone. Maisie had a fine new dress by then, a deep blue one, well made and warm, sewn by her mother's own careful hand from fabric Cole had bought without ever asking first whether he should. But tucked away in the bottom of her small trunk, folded down small, was a scrap of faded brown cloth cut from the old dress she had worn that first day in the mercantile. "Why do you keep hold of that old thing?" Cole asked her once, coming across it while helping her unpack her few belongings. "So I remember," Maisie said simply, without any bitterness in it at all, "the day everyone thought I was worthless." Cole knelt down to her height, a habit he had learned without quite noticing he'd learned it. "They were wrong," he told her. "They were wrong about every part of it." That evening, Cole and Nora stood together on the porch and watched Maisie run barefoot across the yard, chasing the ranch dog through the last gold light of the day, laughing loud enough to carry all the way to the fence line. Nobody standing in that yard was counting what anyone was wearing. Nobody needed to anymore. A person's worth was never truly in the cloth on their back, or the name printed on a deed, or the coin sitting in a pocket. It lived instead in the courage to stay kind in a hard, unforgiving place, in the patience to wait out cruelty without ever becoming cruel in return, and in the people who choose to stand beside you once the whole truth finally comes to light. Red Hollow had laughed at a little girl in a patched, faded dress once. By the time the story was finally through, half the town owed her a quiet apology, and the other half had learned, without anyone needing to say it out loud, to think twice before laughing at anyone again. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would truly love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.